I'm the girl your wife saved, but she said you were the one who needed saving." The words floated through the cold morning air at Rose Hill Cemetery and stopped Charles Whitaker as if the ground beneath his polished shoes had disappeared. For a moment, the billionaire did not move. He stood 6 feet from his wife's grave, one hand wrapped around the stem of a white rose, his black overcoat buttoned tight against the October wind. Gray clouds hung low over the hills outside Chicago, and the cemetery was almost empty except for the distant hum of traffic beyond the iron fence and the soft whisper of dry leaves sliding across the grass. Charles had come before sunrise because that was when grief hurt the least. In the early morning, there were no reporters, no board members, no relatives asking whether he was ready to move on, no assistants reminding him of meetings he no longer cared about. There was only Eleanor's name carved into pale stone, the dates beneath it, and the silence he had been carrying for 3 years. But now, standing beside that stone, was a little black girl in a faded yellow jacket, no older than 8, holding a handful of wildflowers tied with blue yarn. Her hair was braided neatly with tiny white beads at the ends, and around her wrist was a thin blue bracelet that looked too familiar to be possible. Charles stared at it first, then at her face. She did not look frightened. Careful, yes. Small, yes. But not afraid. Her brown eyes were steady in a way that made him uncomfortable, because they did not ask for permission to see him. They simply saw him. "Who are you?" Charles asked, though his voice came out lower than he intended. The girl glanced at the headstone, then back at him. "My name is Nia Brooks." Her fingers tightened around the flowers. "I come every Thursday." Charles felt something sharp twist in his chest. Thursday had been Eleanor's favorite day. She used to say it was the gentlest day of the week, far enough from Monday to forgive it, close enough to the weekend to hope. He swallowed and looked at the grave. There were other flowers there, not the expensive arrangements his staff sometimes sent on his behalf, but small things, daisies, purple clover, a paper crane protected beneath a clear stone, and one smooth river rock painted with a sun. He had noticed them before. He had assumed they were mistakes, offerings left at the wrong grave by someone grieving too hard to read names. "You should not be here alone," he said. "I'm not alone," Nia answered softly. "She listens." Charles turned to her, anger rising before he could stop it. Not loud anger, not cruel, but the kind that comes when pain has been locked too long in a room with no windows. "You did not know my wife." Nia looked down at the wildflowers. "Yes, sir, I did." The wind moved through the cemetery, tugging at the ribbon on the bouquet. Charles wanted to tell her to leave. He wanted to protect the only place where Eleanor still felt close. Instead, his eyes fell again to the bracelet on Nia's wrist. Blue cord, silver clasp, tiny charm shaped like a bird. Eleanor had worn one exactly like it in the final photograph taken of her, standing outside a children's reading center on the south side, smiling in a navy sweater while Charles was 3 states away, closing a deal. He had never asked who took the picture. He had never asked why she looked happier there than she had looked in their mansion. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Nia touched the bracelet with her thumb. "Mrs. Eleanor gave it to me." The name, spoken by a child's voice, broke through him more painfully than any formal condolence ever had. Mrs. Eleanor. Not Mrs. Whitaker. Not the late philanthropist. Not his wife in some newspaper archive. Mrs. Eleanor, as if she had been someone who sat in small rooms, remembered birthdays, bent down to listen. Charles slowly lowered the rose to his side. When Nia looked at the grave again, and her voice became quieter, before she got too tired to visit. The world around him seemed to narrow. The grass, the stone, the yellow jacket, the blue bracelet, the little bouquet shaking in small hands. Charles had known Eleanor was sick. He had paid for every specialist, every private room, every treatment available in America. He had moved mountains made of money. But he had not known she was visiting children. He had not known she was giving away bracelets. He had not known there was a little girl who came to his wife's grave every Thursday, like she was keeping a promise. "What did she save you from?" he asked, and the question sounded different from the man who asked it, less like a billionaire, more like a husband who had lost the map to his own marriage. Nia lifted her chin. "From being forgotten." Charles could not answer. The rose slipped slightly in his hand, petals brushing the dark wool of his coat. Forgotten. That word echoed through him. Down hallways of a house where Eleanor's music no longer played, past dining rooms set for one, past locked doors he had not opened since the funeral. He had thought grief meant remembering someone too much. But looking at Nia, he wondered if his grief had made him forget the very parts of Eleanor that mattered most. The girl stepped closer to the grave and placed the wildflowers beside his expensive rose arrangement, careful not to disturb anything. Then she whispered, "I told her I would keep bringing flowers until you came back for real." Charles looked at her sharply. "For real?" Nia nodded. "Not just your shoes." He almost frowned, but her meaning landed before the expression formed. She had seen him come here before. The dark car, the polished shoes, the silent man who stood for 5 minutes, left flowers, and disappeared before feeling anything. She had seen him, perhaps more clearly than any adult in his life. His jaw tightened, but not from anger this time. "What else did she tell you?" he asked. Nia turned toward him, the beads in her braids clicking softly in the wind. "She said you built tall buildings because you did not know how to stay in small rooms where people could love you." Charles felt the breath leave his body. Eleanor had once said something close to that during an argument in their kitchen, one rainy night when he had taken a call instead of sitting beside her. He had dismissed it then, promised they would talk later, and later had become a country he never reached. Nia watched his face change. She did not smile. She did not seem proud of hurting him. She simply stood there, holding the truth with both hands. Because no one else had. "She said you were not a bad man," Nia continued. "Just a lonely one who kept pretending being busy was the same as being brave." The cemetery bell rang in the distance, one slow note from the chapel near the east gate. Charles closed his eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, he did not see Eleanor in a hospital bed or a framed portrait or a memory polished by regret. He saw her sitting somewhere bright, speaking gently to this child, giving away the kindness he had been too distracted to notice. When he opened his eyes, Nia was watching him with quiet patience. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because she asked me to," Nia said. Then she reached into the pocket of her yellow jacket and pulled out a folded envelope, softened at the corners from being carried too long. Charles saw his name written across the front in Eleanor's handwriting, and the rose finally fell from his hand onto the grass. Charles stared at the envelope as though it had appeared from another lifetime. The paper was cream-colored, slightly worn around the edges, and unmistakably Eleanor's. He would have recognized her handwriting anywhere. For years it had appeared on birthday cards, grocery lists, sticky notes left beside his coffee cup, and letters she sometimes tucked into his suitcase before business trips. Seeing it now felt impossible. The cemetery seemed quieter than before. Even the wind had softened. Nia held the envelope carefully between both hands, not offering it yet, simply waiting. Charles swallowed hard. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Nia glanced down at the name written across the front. "Mrs. Eleanor gave it to me." Charles felt his pulse quicken. "That is not possible." The words came out sharper than he intended. Nia did not flinch. She looked at the grave, then back at him. "She gave it to me a long time ago. She told me to keep it safe until you were ready." Charles almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because grief sometimes twisted itself into disbelief. Ready. People had been telling him to be ready for 3 years. Ready to move forward. Ready to date again. Ready to stop visiting the cemetery. Ready to let go. Yet every morning, he still woke up reaching toward the empty side of the bed. Every evening, he still found himself listening for footsteps that would never return. He was not ready for anything. Nia seemed to understand that without being told. She stepped closer to the headstone and carefully adjusted one of the wildflowers that had shifted in the breeze. "She used to do that too," Charles said quietly before he realized he had spoken aloud. Nia smiled faintly. "Fix flowers." Charles nodded. Every time she saw one leaning the wrong way, Nia's smile grew a little. She said flowers deserved dignity. The sentence hit him harder than he expected. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. Not the polished public version who appeared beside him at charity galas. The real Eleanor. The woman who stopped to talk to strangers. The woman who remembered names. The woman who once spent 20 minutes helping a little boy rescue a turtle crossing a parking lot while Charles waited impatiently in the car. The woman he loved. And somehow, somewhere along the way, the woman he had stopped fully seeing. The realization settled heavily over him. "How did you know her?" he finally asked. Nia looked toward the distant rows of graves stretching across the hillside. "My grandma cleaned rooms at a community center on the south side. Mrs. Eleanor came every week. Charles frowned slightly. He had never heard of such a place. Nia continued. She read books to kids. She brought snacks. Sometimes she sat and listened when people needed someone to talk to. Charles lowered his eyes. Eleanor had told him many times that she volunteered. He had assumed she meant writing checks, attending fundraisers, making appearances. He had never asked questions. He had always been rushing somewhere else. She knew everybody, Nia said softly. Even people who thought nobody knew them. The cemetery bell sounded once in the distance. Charles looked at the envelope again. And she gave this to you? Nia nodded. About 6 months before she died. The words landed like cold rain. 6 months before she died. During that time, Charles had spent most of his days traveling between New York, Dallas, Seattle, and Los Angeles. He remembered conference rooms, earnings reports, private flights, investor dinners. He remembered believing there would always be more time. Time had seemed unlimited then. Now it felt like the rarest thing in the world. Nia reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small photograph. She handed it to him. Charles hesitated before taking it. The image showed Eleanor sitting on a folding chair beneath colorful paper decorations. Children surrounded her from every side. One little girl sat beside her wearing a bright yellow jacket. Nia. Eleanor's smile in the picture was radiant. Not forced. Not formal. Real. Charles stared at it for several seconds. She looks happy, he whispered. She was, Nia answered. She always smiled when she came there. Charles felt a painful warmth spread through his chest. He could not remember the last time he had seen that version of her. The successful businessman in him had always measured life through schedules, achievements, acquisitions, and deadlines. Eleanor measured life differently. She measured it through people, through moments, through kindness. Nia watched him quietly. She talked about you a lot. Charles looked up immediately. She did. Nia nodded. She loved you very much. The words nearly broke him. For years he had replayed every mistake, every missed dinner, every canceled weekend, every phone call he had taken instead of listening. Regret had become a permanent shadow. Yet hearing that simple sentence from a child somehow carried more weight than all the comfort offered by friends and therapists combined. Nia lowered her eyes toward the envelope. She also worried about you. Charles let out a slow breath. That sounds more accurate. Nia's expression remained gentle. She said sometimes people build walls because they are scared of losing things. Charles looked at the marble headstone. And what did she say about me after she got sick? Nia was silent for a moment. The wind lifted a few strands of hair across her forehead. She said you loved her with your whole heart. Charles closed his eyes. Then why do I feel like I failed her? When he opened them again, Nia was studying him. Carefully. Not judging. Not pitying. Simply listening. It was the same look Eleanor used to give him. The realization made his throat tighten. Because, Nia said softly, when people love someone very much, they think they should have been able to stop sad things from happening. Charles stared at her. The cemetery disappeared. The traffic beyond the gates disappeared. Even the cold October air seemed to fade away. There was only that sentence. A sentence no board member, therapist, friend, or relative had ever managed to say. Nia slowly extended the envelope toward him. This time she did not pull it back. Mrs. Eleanor said you would understand it when the time was right. Charles looked at his name written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for it. And for the first time in 3 years, he was not afraid of what the past might contain. He was afraid of what it might reveal about the future. Charles held the envelope for a long moment without opening it. The cemetery seemed suspended between breaths. Somewhere beyond the rows of marble headstones, a church bell echoed softly across the hillside, but even that sound felt distant. His attention remained fixed on the familiar handwriting. Eleanor. 3 years after losing her, her words were somehow still finding their way to him. Nia stood quietly beside the grave, giving him space. She did not rush him. She did not ask questions. The little blue bracelet glimmered faintly beneath the gray morning sky. Finally, Charles slid one finger beneath the seal and carefully unfolded the letter inside. The paper crackled gently in the cold air. His eyes moved across the first line, and immediately his chest tightened. My dear Charles, if you are reading this, then a very stubborn little girl finally convinced you to stop running. He closed his eyes for a second. A shaky breath escaped him. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. Warm, honest, playful even when speaking about difficult things. He looked down, and continued reading. I know you better than anyone. I know that after I am gone, you will try to fill every empty space with work. You will attend more meetings. You will build more buildings. You will stay busy because busy feels safer than grief. Charles lowered the letter slightly. The words struck with uncomfortable precision. Nia watched his expression carefully. She always said she could tell what people were feeling before they could, the girl said softly. Charles almost smiled despite himself. She was annoyingly good at that. Nia smiled too. For the first time that morning, the sadness around them loosened slightly. Charles returned his attention to the page. But if you are reading this, something wonderful happened. It means you finally stopped long enough to listen. Maybe to yourself. Maybe to someone else. Either way, I am proud of you. His throat tightened again. Proud. The word carried a weight he had not realized he missed. During the years since Eleanor's passing, he had received awards, recognition, magazine covers, and speeches praising his accomplishments. None of them had ever meant as much as that single word written in her hand. A gust of wind swept across the cemetery, rustling the trees overhead. Charles folded the letter carefully before placing it inside his coat pocket. He was not ready to read the rest. Not yet. Some things deserve time. He looked at Nia. How often did you see her? The little girl glanced toward the flowers. Almost every week for 2 years. Charles blinked. 2 years. 2 entire years of visits. Conversations. Memories. A hidden part of Eleanor's life that he had never known existed. What did she do there? Nia smiled as though recalling something precious. Everything. Charles raised an eyebrow. Nia laughed softly. She read books. Helped people fill out forms. Brought snacks. Helped kids with homework. Sometimes she just listened. Charles looked down. Listening. Eleanor had always believed listening was one of the most important things a person could do. He remembered how she would sit at their kitchen table late at night, giving someone her full attention as if nothing else in the world mattered. He used to admire that quality. Somewhere along the way, he had become too distracted to practice it himself. Nia suddenly reached into her jacket pocket again. This time she pulled out a folded photograph. She wanted you to see this someday. Charles accepted it carefully. The picture showed Eleanor standing beside a mural painted in bright colors. Children surrounded her, smiling toward the camera. Near the center stood Nia, several years younger, holding Eleanor's hand. But something else caught his attention. Eleanor looked happier than he had seen her in years. Not because of luxury, not because of success, simply because she was present. Charles stared at the image. I do not remember this day. Nia looked at the photograph. She talked about you that day. Charles glanced up. Really? Nia nodded. She said she wished you could see what she saw here. The words settled heavily over him. For years he had assumed he was providing everything Eleanor wanted. Security, comfort, opportunity. Yet looking at that photograph, he began to wonder if she had been hoping for something much simpler. Not money, not achievements, just his presence, just his time. The realization hurt, but it also felt strangely freeing. For the first time in years, his grief was no longer only about loss. It was becoming understanding. Nia carefully adjusted one of the wildflowers near the headstone. She told me something else too. Charles looked at her. What was that? Nia hesitated for a moment before answering. She said that one day you would come here thinking you lost her. The wind stirred again. Charles felt his heart pound softly against his ribs. And? Nia asked. And she said you would discover she left pieces of herself everywhere. Charles looked around the cemetery. At the flowers. At the little bracelet. At the photograph in his hands. At the child standing beside him. For the first time since Eleanor's death, the emptiness inside him did not feel endless. It felt like the beginning of a path he had never noticed before. Charles remained at the cemetery long after the clouds began to thin. The photograph rested in one hand while Eleanor's letter remained tucked safely inside his coat. Nia sat quietly on a nearby stone bench, swinging her feet a few inches above the ground. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to leave. The silence between them felt different now, less awkward, less guarded. For the first time in years, Charles was sitting beside someone who spoke about Eleanor as if she were still close enough to touch. Eventually, he glanced toward the little girl. What was she like when she was there? Nia smiled immediately. It was the kind of smile that arrived before words. She made everybody feel important. Charles looked down at the photograph. She always did that. Nia nodded. Even when she was tired. That detail caught his attention. Tired. Nia drew small circles on the bench with one finger. Sometimes she would sit down for a few minutes before reading to us. Grandma told her she should rest more. Mrs. Eleanor always laughed and said she could rest later. Charles stared toward the distant trees. He remembered those years. Eleanor often came home exhausted. He assumed it was because of medical appointments. He never imagined she was spending her energy helping strangers. The realization settled heavily inside him. Not as guilt this time, but as admiration. Nia suddenly pointed toward the folded photograph. That was the day she painted the wall. Charles blinked. Painted the wall. Nia nodded enthusiastically. The mural behind us. Everybody got paint on their clothes. Grandma was not happy. A soft laugh escaped him before he could stop it. It felt unfamiliar. He could not remember the last time he had laughed while thinking about Eleanor. Nia smiled when she heard it. She laughed like that too. Charles shook his head. No, her laugh was better. Nia giggled. That is true. For a moment, the years seemed to fold together. The grief that had dominated every memory loosened enough for warmth to return. Charles found himself asking questions. Small questions at first. What books Eleanor liked to read to the children. What games she played. Whether she talked about traveling. Each answer painted a version of his wife that felt both familiar and brand new. The sun slowly emerged from behind the clouds, spreading pale golden light across the cemetery. Nia squinted toward the brightness. She liked mornings. Charles nodded immediately. She loved them. She said mornings give people another chance. Charles smiled faintly. That sounded exactly like Eleanor. Another chance. She believed in those more than anyone he had ever known. He looked toward the headstone again. 3 years. 3 years spent believing he had lost everything. Yet sitting here with Nia, he was beginning to discover pieces of Eleanor he never knew existed. It felt less like losing her and more like meeting her again. The thought startled him. Nia suddenly hopped down from the bench. I should go. Charles looked surprised. Already. The question slipped out before he could stop it. Nia noticed. Her smile softened. Grandma gets worried if I am late. Charles nodded slowly. Of course. The little girl adjusted the strap of her worn backpack. Then she hesitated. Would you like to see where Mrs. Eleanor used to volunteer? Charles looked at her carefully. The invitation seemed simple, yet something about it felt important. A doorway opening. A path Eleanor had once walked. He glanced at the photograph again, then at the letter resting inside his coat, then at the grave. For years he had come here searching for a connection that never lasted beyond a few minutes. Now that connection was standing in front of him wearing a yellow jacket and a blue bracelet. Yes, he said quietly. I think I would. Nia's face brightened immediately. Good. Charles stood and brushed a few leaves from his coat. Together they walked toward the cemetery gate. As they passed beneath the iron archway, he glanced back one final time. The flowers moved gently in the breeze. The morning sunlight touched the marble headstone. And for the first time since Eleanor's passing, he did not feel as though he was leaving her behind. Somehow, through the kindness of a little girl, it felt as though she was leading him forward. The drive across the city felt strangely unfamiliar to Charles, even though he had traveled these streets thousands of times. Nia sat quietly in the passenger seat of his black sedan, her backpack resting on her lap, occasionally pointing out landmarks through the window. The towering glass buildings of downtown gradually gave way to older neighborhoods filled with brick storefronts, painted murals, and small family-owned businesses. Charles realized he had not visited this part of Chicago in years. Not because he disliked it, but because his life had slowly narrowed into offices, boardrooms, airports, and private dining rooms. The world Eleanor had chosen to spend time in existed only a few miles away, yet it felt like an entirely different country. After 20 minutes, Nia pointed toward a red brick building at the end of the block. There. Charles slowed the car. The structure was modest compared to the buildings he owned. A colorful mural covered one side, painted with children reading books beneath bright blue skies. Flower boxes lined the windows. The sign above the entrance read Southside Community Learning Center. Charles stared at it silently. Eleanor had never mentioned the name. Nia climbed out and walked toward the front door. As soon as she stepped inside, several people greeted her. A woman arranging books near the entrance smiled warmly. Nia, there you are. Then her eyes moved to Charles. Confusion crossed her face first, followed by surprise. Mr. Whitaker? Charles nodded politely. Before he could speak, Another voice echoed from deeper inside the building. Charles. He turned. An elderly woman with silver hair stood frozen beside a hallway lined with children's artwork. Her name was Gloria Brooks, Nia's grandmother. Charles recognized her immediately, not from this place, but from somewhere else. You worked at our house, he said quietly. Gloria smiled gently. For almost 11 years. The realization struck him like a sudden light. Gloria had been one of the household staff years ago. Eleanor always spoke highly of her. Charles remembered brief conversations in passing, but little more. The memory brought an uncomfortable feeling. How many people had moved through his life while he barely noticed them? Gloria stepped forward and folded her hands. Eleanor talked about you often. Charles lowered his eyes. Nia has been telling me that. Gloria studied him carefully. Then you are finally hearing the stories she hoped you would hear. The words lingered between them. Nia wandered toward a reading corner filled with beanbags and shelves of books. Several younger children immediately gathered around her. Their laughter filled the room. Charles watched as she knelt beside a little boy struggling with a picture book. Within seconds, she was helping him sound out words. The sight made him smile. Gloria noticed. She learned that from Eleanor. Charles looked around the center. Photographs covered one wall. Volunteer events. School programs. Holiday gatherings. Community dinners. His eyes moved slowly across dozens of pictures until they stopped. There, near the center of the display, was Eleanor. She appeared again and again, reading stories, serving food, painting murals, helping children with homework, sitting beside seniors, smiling in nearly every frame. Charles stepped closer. The wall seemed endless. She was here this much, he asked softly. Gloria nodded. Every week. He stared at the photographs. Why did she never tell me? Gloria's expression remained kind. Perhaps she did. Charles turned toward her. She continued gently. Maybe you were simply carrying too much to hear it. The answer hurt because it was true. He remembered evenings when Eleanor mentioned volunteer projects while he checked emails. He remembered mornings when she tried to tell him about people she met while he rushed toward another meeting. She had not hidden this part of her life. He had overlooked it. Across the room, Nia suddenly waved. Mr. Whitaker, come look. Charles walked over. On a nearby shelf sat a framed picture. Eleanor stood beside Nia, several years younger, both holding paintbrushes covered in bright colors. Their faces were smeared with blue and yellow paint. They looked ridiculous. They looked happy. Charles laughed softly. She got paint on her face. Nia grinned. She said great artists always do. For a moment, the grief inside him shifted again. It was still there. It always would be. But now it shared space with something else. Understanding. Pride. Gratitude. The woman he loved had left far more behind than memories. She had left kindness scattered throughout an entire community. And everywhere Charles looked, he found people carrying pieces of her forward. As the afternoon, sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the community center, Charles found himself lingering long after he had intended to leave. Children moved through the hallways carrying books and art supplies. Volunteers prepared snacks in a small kitchen, and laughter drifted from room to room like music. It was not the sort of place that appeared in financial reports or investment portfolios. Yet somehow it felt more alive than any building he owned. Nia sat at a round table near the reading corner, carefully helping a younger girl color a picture of a sunflower. Every few minutes the child looked up at her for approval, and every time Nia offered the same encouraging smile. Charles watched quietly from across the room. The scene reminded him so much of Eleanor that it almost hurt. Gloria appeared beside him carrying a small cardboard box. It looked old, its edges softened by time. She held it carefully, as though it contained something fragile. There is something Eleanor asked me to keep, Gloria said. Charles turned toward her. For me? Gloria nodded. She said the day would come when you were finally ready to see it. His eyes moved to the box. The words sounded familiar. Ready. Eleanor seemed to have left instructions for a future version of him she somehow believed would eventually exist. Gloria placed the box on a nearby table. For a moment Charles simply stared at it. Then he slowly lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, handwritten notes, children's drawings, and several envelopes bundled together with a faded blue ribbon. The sight immediately tightened his throat. Nia noticed and quietly walked over. Together they looked inside. Charles picked up the first photograph. Eleanor stood beside an elderly man holding a birthday cake. Another showed her reading to a circle of children seated cross-legged on the floor. Another captured her planting flowers in front of the center. Every image revealed a piece of her life he had never fully known. Then he noticed something else. Many of the photographs had notes written on the back in Eleanor's handwriting. He turned one over. Mr. Jenkins smiled today after 3 weeks of sadness. Sometimes hope arrives disguised as a conversation. Charles swallowed hard. He picked up another. Nia finished her first chapter book. She was so proud she almost forgot to breathe. His hands trembled slightly. Each note preserved a moment that otherwise would have disappeared forever. Nia leaned closer. She wrote things down because she never wanted to forget people. Charles smiled sadly. That sounds exactly like her. Deeper inside the box sat a larger envelope with his name written across the front. He carefully opened it. A folded letter slipped into his hands. The paper was different from the one he carried in his coat. Older, longer. As he unfolded it, Eleanor's familiar handwriting filled the page. Dear Charles, if you are reading this, then you finally found the place that changed me. He immediately felt his chest tighten. Around him, the sounds of the community center seemed to fade. I know you always believed I came here to help other people. The truth is that they helped me. They reminded me that success is not measured by what we build for ourselves. It is measured by what remains in the hearts of others when we are gone. Charles lowered his eyes. The sentence lingered inside him. For years he had measured life through achievements, growth, expansion, and numbers. Yet standing here among Eleanor's memories, those things suddenly felt very small. He continued reading. I hope one day you meet the people who taught me that kindness is never wasted. Especially one little girl with a blue bracelet. Nia's eyes widened. That is me. Charles looked at her and felt a warmth spread through his chest. Eleanor had known. Somehow she had known this meeting would matter. The letter continued. If Nia is beside you, then please listen to her. She sees things adults forget to notice. Charles looked over at the little girl. She immediately shrugged. I told you she was smart. A laugh escaped him. A genuine one. Several children looked up curiously before returning to their activities. For the first time in years, the sound did not feel strange. It felt natural. He folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Then he looked around the room once more. The murals, the books, the photographs, the children. Everywhere he turned, he found evidence of the life Eleanor had quietly built beyond the reach of wealth and status. And for the first time since losing her, Charles realized something remarkable. She had not left behind an empty space. She had left behind a living legacy. One that was still growing, still helping, still changing lives every single day. The following Monday morning, Charles returned to his headquarters overlooking downtown Chicago. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline. Assistants moved through polished hallways, and schedules filled every screen. Everything looked exactly as it had a week earlier. Yet nothing felt the same. As he entered the executive conference room, conversations immediately quieted. Board members straightened in their seats. Financial reports waited neatly arranged at every chair. Normally, Charles would have walked directly to the head of the table and begun discussing numbers. Instead, his attention drifted toward the framed photograph he had placed inside his briefcase before leaving home. Eleanor and Nia stood smiling beneath a mural covered in bright colors. For a moment, he forgot the quarterly projections entirely. Charles, a voice interrupted. He looked up. Martin Hayes, the company's chief legal advisor, was studying him carefully. Martin had worked beside him for more than a decade. Reliable, efficient, practical, the sort of man who believed every problem could be solved with paperwork and logic. Are we ready to begin? Martin asked. Charles nodded slowly and took his seat. The meeting started normally. Revenue forecasts, expansion plans, investment opportunities. But halfway through the presentation, Charles found himself staring out the window instead of at the charts. He thought about the community center, about children gathered around books, about the photographs covering an entire wall, about the life Eleanor had built quietly while everyone else had been focused on business. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. Finally, he raised one hand. The room fell silent. I want a full report on every charitable initiative Eleanor supported. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. Martin adjusted his glasses. We have archived records available. I want more than records, Charles replied. I want details. Martin frowned slightly. May I ask why? Charles looked around the table. For years, he would have considered the question reasonable. Today it felt strangely small. Because I should have asked a long time ago. No one responded. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then the meeting continued, though Charles could feel curiosity growing around him. By late afternoon, he found himself reviewing photographs from the community center instead of acquisition proposals. The more he learned, the more questions appeared. Eleanor had helped fund reading programs, scholarship projects, food drives, mentorship groups, and neighborhood improvements. Yet most of it had been done quietly. No press releases, no publicity campaigns, no recognition, just kindness. Near sunset, Martin entered Charles's office carrying several folders. I gathered everything I could find. Charles motioned toward a chair. Martin sat down and placed the documents on the desk. His expression remained thoughtful. There is something else you should know. Charles looked up. What is it? Martin hesitated briefly. The community center has been struggling financially. Charles immediately straightened. Since when? Several months. Martin opened one folder. Donations have decreased. Maintenance costs increased. There have been discussions about reducing programs. Charles stared at the paperwork. The words felt wrong. The place Eleanor loved. The place still helping children every day. The place carrying her legacy forward. Why was I never informed? Martin chose his answer carefully. Technically, the organization is independent. It was not connected to Whitaker Enterprises. Charles lowered his eyes. Independent? Of course it was. Eleanor had never wanted her kindness attached to a corporate logo. She believed people mattered more than publicity. Yet the thought of the center struggling unsettled him deeply. That evening, after leaving the office, Charles drove directly back to the Southside neighborhood. The sky glowed orange. Above the city as streetlights flickered on one by one. When he arrived, children were still gathered inside the center finishing after-school activities. Through the front window, he spotted Nia, sitting at a table helping two younger students with reading exercises. She looked up and immediately smiled when she saw him. Somehow that smile felt more welcoming than any greeting he received in the skyscraper downtown. Charles stepped inside. The familiar sounds of laughter and conversation surrounded him. Nia hurried over. You came back. Charles nodded. I wanted to. Nia seemed pleased by the answer. Then she noticed the thoughtful expression on his face. Something is wrong. It was not a question. Charles almost laughed. Eleanor had been right. The little girl noticed things adults missed. He looked around the room filled with books, artwork, and children. Then he spoke honestly. I learned this place may need help. Nia followed his gaze. Her smile faded slightly. Grandma knows. Charles turned toward her. You know too? Nia nodded. Everybody here knows. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The evening sunlight stretched across the floor between them. Finally, Nia looked up. Mrs. Eleanor used to say that when something important is hurting, the worst thing you can do is pretend not to see it. Charles felt the words settle deep inside him. Because for years that was exactly what he had done. Not out of cruelty. Not out of indifference. Simply because he had been too busy looking somewhere else. But now he was finally paying attention. And this time, he had no intention of looking away. That night, Charles sat alone in the library of his penthouse overlooking the city lights. The room had once been Eleanor's favorite place. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with novels, biographies, poetry collections, and travel journals. For 3 years he had rarely entered it. The silence reminded him too much of what he had lost. Yet now he found himself sitting in her favorite chair with the box from the community center resting beside him. The city shimmered beyond the glass, but his attention remained fixed on a final envelope hidden beneath it. Photographs and letters. Unlike the others, this one carried a small note written in Eleanor's handwriting. Open this only when you are ready to choose what matters most. Charles stared at the words for several seconds before carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting seemed steadier than in her later letters. He began to read. Charles, if you have reached this letter, then you have already discovered something I hoped you would learn without me. People are always more important than plans. He closed his eyes briefly. The sentence alone felt powerful enough to stop time. He continued reading. You spent your life building extraordinary things. I admired that about you. But sometimes I worried you forgot that the most important things cannot be measured. They cannot be counted. They cannot be owned. They can only be shared. Charles swallowed hard. The words felt less like criticism and more like a gentle hand guiding him toward a truth he had spent years avoiding. Then he reached the final paragraph. If the community center ever needs help, promise me something. Do not save it because it reminds you of me. Save it because it reminds you of who you are capable of becoming. His vision blurred slightly. He lowered the letter and stared across the room. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, he understood what she had been trying to teach him all along. Grief was not asking him to live in the past. Love was asking him to carry something forward. The next morning, before sunrise, Charles returned to the South Side neighborhood. A cold breeze moved through the streets as the city slowly awakened. The community center was still closed when he arrived. Yet someone was already there. Nia sat on the front steps with a book resting in her lap. She looked up and smiled when she saw him. I knew you would come. Charles laughed softly. How? Nia shrugged. Mrs. Eleanor was usually right about people. He sat beside her on the steps. For a moment neither spoke. The early morning light painted the buildings gold. Finally Charles looked toward the entrance. I read her last letter. Nia closed her book. What did it say? Charles stared ahead. It said I spent too much time measuring the wrong things. Nia nodded thoughtfully. That sounds like her too. Charles smiled. Then his expression grew serious. Tell me something honestly. Nia tilted her head. Okay. He looked at the center. What happens if this place closes? The little girl's smile disappeared. She glanced toward the mural on the wall. Some kids would lose their tutoring. Some families would lose help. Some people would lose the only place that feels safe when life gets hard. Her voice remained calm, but the answer carried weight far beyond her years. Charles listened carefully. This time he did not interrupt. He did not look away. He simply listened. Nia looked down at the blue bracelet on her wrist. Mrs. Eleanor used to say buildings are important because of what happens inside them. Charles felt those words settle deep within him. All his life, he had built structures, towers, offices, hotels, developments. Yet perhaps the true value of a building had never been the architecture. It was the lives touched inside its walls. Slowly he stood and looked at the community center. Children would arrive soon. Volunteers would unlock the doors. Another ordinary day would begin. But Charles knew something had changed. Not in the building. In himself. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Eleanor's final letter. Then he folded it carefully and returned it to his pocket. She was right, he said quietly. Nia looked up. About what? Charles smiled, and for the first time in years the expression reached his eyes. About who I am capable of becoming. 3 months later, the first snow of winter drifted gently across Chicago as children hurried through the front doors of the community center, carrying backpacks and laughter. The building looked different now. Fresh paint brightened the hallways. New books filled the shelves. Classrooms once threatened by closure were busy every afternoon. A scholarship fund had been established. After-school programs had expanded. Families who once worried about losing the center now spoke about its future with hope. Yet the most remarkable change was not the building itself. It was the people inside it. Charles stood near the entrance watching children arrive. He no longer wore the expression that had followed him for 3 years. The sadness remained, but it no longer defined him. It had softened into something quieter, something gentler. He still missed Eleanor every day. He always would. But now the memory of her brought warmth alongside grief. Across the room, Nia sat helping several younger students with reading assignments. Every few minutes, she encouraged someone who was struggling or celebrated a small success. The blue bracelet still rested on her wrist. Charles smiled whenever he saw it. Not because it reminded him of loss, but because it reminded him of connection. Gloria approached carrying a tray of hot chocolate cups. You are smiling again, she observed. Charles accepted a cup and laughed softly. Apparently people keep pointing that out. Gloria smiled. Because it matters. Before he could answer, a small crowd of children rushed toward him holding handmade holiday cards. One by one they handed them over. Some featured drawings of books. Others showed bright flowers, snowflakes, or colorful murals. One simply read, "Thank you, Mr. Charles," in large, uneven letters. He accepted each card carefully. Years ago, he might have framed awards or business achievements. Now these pieces of paper felt more valuable than anything displayed in his office. Later that afternoon, after the center quieted, Nia walked over carrying a small box. What is that? Charles asked. She placed it on the table between them. The kids wanted to give you something. Charles opened the box. Inside rested dozens of folded notes written by children from the center. Some thanked him for new books. Others talked about tutoring programs or art classes. One little boy wrote that he finally learned how to read an entire chapter by himself. Another child drew a picture of the building surrounded by hearts. Charles slowly looked up. His eyes glistened slightly. This is too much. Nia shook her head. Mrs. Eleanor used to say kindness grows when people know it matters. Charles smiled. She really said a lot of things, did she not? Nia laughed. All the time. The room filled with comfortable silence. Snowflakes drifted past the windows. The community center felt warm despite the cold outside. After a few minutes, Nia reached into her backpack and removed a single folded photograph. Charles immediately recognized it. It was the picture of Eleanor standing beside the mural years earlier. Nia placed it in front of him. You should keep it. Charles looked surprised. Are you sure? Nia nodded. I think it belongs with you now. He stared at the image. Eleanor's smile seemed almost alive. For a moment, he remembered the lonely mornings at the cemetery, the empty rooms, the endless regret. Then he looked around the center filled with laughter and purpose. He understood something important. The journey had never been about finding a way to stop missing Eleanor. It had been about learning how to honor her by living differently. Slowly, he placed the photograph inside his coat pocket. Thank you, he said. Nia smiled. You already thanked me. Charles shook his head. Not for this. The little girl tilted her head. Then for what? He looked toward the mural, the books, the children, and finally the blue bracelet on her wrist. For helping me see what was right in front of me all along. Nia thought about that for a moment before giving a small nod. Mrs. Eleanor knew you would. As evening approached, Charles left the center and drove toward Rosehill Cemetery. Snow covered the ground in a thin white blanket. The world felt peaceful. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and the photograph in the other. When he reached the grave, he stood quietly for several moments. Then he placed the flowers beside the headstone. The winter wind moved gently through the trees. Charles looked at Eleanor's name and smiled. Not because he no longer missed her. Not because the pain had disappeared, but because he finally understood the gift she had left behind. He slipped the photograph into his coat pocket and spoke softly into the evening air. You did not leave me alone. Snowflakes drifted around him. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Charles looked toward the darkening sky and continued. You left me a reason to become better. Then, for the first time in many years, he turned away from the grave carrying not only memory, but hope. And as he walked back toward the cemetery gate, the lights of the city glowing beyond the hills, he realized that the greatest legacy Eleanor had left behind was not a building, a program, or even a collection of letters. It was the simple truth she had taught through a little girl with a blue bracelet, that a life becomes meaningful not by how much it keeps, but by how much it gives.